So today we're just going to kind of talk through kind of professionalism in the workplace, different standards. I think one thing is it's always kind of important when you're thinking about professionalism is, what does it mean to you personally to be a professional? Um, Everywhere around the world, sometimes there's going to be a little bit different cultural standards. Things for how kind of assertive you are, how responsive you are. There's kind of general, guidelines, of course, but there are definitely things that can be very cultural, right? Or if you come from somewhere where, authority is really respected, and so like questioning your boss would be seen as a really big deal that you would maybe only do in a huge situation if there's like a big error at stake that might cost the company a lot of money versus if you're somebody where you're like, oh no, I feel very comfortable, questioning my boss about this process that I have a difference of opinion about, right? So there are definitely those kind of cultural things at play sometimes. So what I would say is, again, I think most of these things are always good general standards, but I'm always going to be predominantly speaking to kind of US professionalism standards. But even within the US, right, you're going to have individuals who have kind of their own preferences, their own biases potentially. There's a lot of research out there on kind of those first impressions. And so, for any kind of that like verbal communication, how do you greet people? What's the tone like? What language choices are you using? But there's a lot that people pick up on nonverbals. And this often isn't even conscious. A lot of times people will say, well, the first 10 seconds are when you kind of tend to make those initial judgments about people, but people actually form impressions in fractions of a second. If you walk into a room and you're looking really confident, you're appropriately dressed, you seem friendly, right? That's going to be a different perception than somebody who maybe isn't dressed appropriately for the workplace. If they look really nervous coming in, they're kind of hunched over, they're not making eye contact with people, right? So, again, you don't necessarily have to be making eye contact the entire time or staring people down weirdly, but you do want to make sure that you are occasionally, looking at people, or if you're in kind of a virtual environment, if you look at your camera, it will simulate that eye contact more because if you're looking at your screen the entire time, it often kind of looks like you're looking down. So, just something to keep in mind on that front. So, in terms of professional attire, um, obviously you're going to want to understand what that environment is like. If it's a really casual environment, if you're getting a job as a personal trainer at a gym, right, wearing a suit would not be appropriate. That would not allow you to do your job. If you are working in a very, intense law firm, that is much more likely to be more kind of a conservative environment where they're going to expect business formal, you're wearing a suit and tie, that sort of attire. So if you can kind of get a sense of like what is normal for that industry, for that company. So if in doubt, what I would say is I would always overdress than underdress. Um, it's better to show that you made an effort, even if that's not something you would necessarily wear every day. And it's very typical that you would sort of dress a step up from what you would wear to work. So, for instance, a lot of businesses these days are what we call business casual, which I'll show an example of in a minute. And so that's where, you might be wearing like khakis and a polo or, some dress pants and a nice blouse. You're not necessarily wearing like the blazer every day. You're not wearing a full suit. Um, for that sort of a situation, then for an interview, you would kind of dress up a little bit more. So it would be nice if you have kind of a suit, if you have a blazer to throw on top of your outfit, that sort of a situation. Um, Avoid letting your outfit distract from your skills and qualifications. So every interviewer is going to have kind of their own individual preferences. And so sometimes there are situations where, for better or for worse, they might say, oh, yes, I remember her because she wore that hot pink top. There's nothing inherently wrong with wearing hot pink. But sometimes that might be the more prevalent impression than like what you talked about. Like sometimes I've had folks where, they wore a lot of jewelry. And when they talked and moved around, they made a lot of noise, like when, their kind of bracelets clacked together, things like that. So, just kind of think through your whole outfit. Make sure to wear, professional shoes, but shoes you can walk in. It's not uncommon for an in-person interview that you might do a tour of the office, of the area you'd be working, if you're walking to different conference rooms. So, make sure that they're things that are kind of sensible for that attire. And, if you're somebody where, you have like a natural hair color, tattoo piercings, again, there's kind of a lot of differences between what's considered acceptable and what's not. So, it's always something where, you would need to follow whatever their stated dress codes are. You might have a sense, like if you're looking up a company, you might be able to find some of their kind of standards or codes, on their website or on sites like Glassdoor. People might write reviews or something and mention that. Um, if you get the job, you're starting a new job somewhere and they don't really give you a very specific dress code, because again, there's a lot of companies where they're just saying, yes, dress appropriately, and they're not giving you every single detail. You can always ask your supervisor about what's typical. Again, I would probably dress up a little bit more at the beginning, kind of see what your coworkers are doing, and then you can adjust from there. And it's also very common, sort of post-pandemic, that places will have dress for your day. So if you have, a meeting with clients, a meeting with external customers, you might look a little bit more dressed up for that than if you're, working remotely, doing data entry by yourself. Then, you're probably not going to be expected to dress up in the same way for that. So for casual attire in a workplace setting, definitely there are places where you can wear jeans to work. That's fine. Sort of nice t-shirts. But still outside of places like working at a gym or something, you're probably still not going to wear like shorts, tank tops, things like that. So it's more of that kind of dress up casual. And then what they call business casual, like I was saying earlier, a lot of times that's kind of more of that khakis and a polo, dress pants, a button down, but maybe in a more interesting color or pattern, a nice dress or skirt that's kind of knee length or longer, things like that. And then business formal, this is really like kind of that traditional what you think of, where it's going to be suits, some matching pieces, like a button down sort of collared shirt. Generally, you want to avoid more of those colorful. So kind of stick more to the, like a black or a navy or a gray suit, with like a white or a blue top, not your oranges or your hot pinks or something necessarily. So, professional communication is one of the top things that employers always are looking for, because they can always train you on a particular, software program, on a process. But if you cannot communicate well, that is going to be a problem in any profession. So, make sure that you're being positive, you're communicating as clearly as possible. Asking good questions is really an art. So, a lot of times that's what's important is if you're interacting with folks, like if a customer is having a problem with your business, asking them some questions to say, okay, well, what's the situation? What have they tried already? Have they talked to somebody else and they're escalating their concerns, right? So the more information you get, the better that you can help. You want to make sure that as you are, providing good service, that you also kind of are aware of what are the boundaries of your role. So, different companies are have kind of different ideas about hierarchical things. So, at what instance is it appropriate for you to get your manager? Because there might be some situations where you say, okay, I went through these steps with a customer, they're having this problem. I'm not authorized to do this next part, right? Like I can't give them a full refund, even though it seems like that is what should happen. So I have to pass this off to somebody else. So again, sometimes things like that is just really good to be aware of because if you're promising people certain things or you say, oh, sure, like I'll take care of that, I'll do that, and then actually that's not really within your scope of power or you need somebody else to sign off on that who may or may not be willing, right? Then that's more likely to get you in trouble. So just kind of understand as you're starting in any role where those lines are. In terms of phone etiquette, so, make sure that you have your voicemail set up. That's often one of those early things you do when you get a new job, but also, if you're job searching, it's really helpful if HR managers are calling you to set up an interview or you've interviewed and they're calling to offer you the position if you have your voicemail set up so someone can leave a message and that if you actually specify what your name is. Because there are definitely people out there where it just says the phone number. And so sometimes that's hard if you are like, well, I think this is the right person, but it's nice to have that as a double check. When you are calling, if you are leaving a message because, maybe you're calling the recruiter back and they're not in the office at the moment, make sure you identify yourself, why you're calling, your email or phone number for people to follow up with, all of those sorts of things. There's a lot of people who just don't do as much work on the phone as they used to with email and Teams and all of these other platforms. So it is really important that you are still following good phone etiquette. For email, um, obviously, if you're doing things for Webster, if you're talking to your academic advisor, you want to use your Webster email. If you are applying to jobs, I would use your personal email for that, right? Because your Webster email will go away after a year since you graduated. So you want to make sure that everyone still has your contact information. Just be aware as you're kind of proofreading, making sure that you're addressing people appropriately. It's always better to go a little bit more formal. Like generally calling people by their first name is fine, but if you know they have an honorific as part of their name, like if they're a professor and they have their PhD, I would call them Dr. Levitt, whatever that might be. Um, if, you're responding to people, right, make sure you spell their name correctly. We've all had those experiences where people haven't spelled our names correctly. It doesn't set you off on a good foot with them. And know that, especially for a lot of workplaces, your emails are not really inherently considered private. Obviously you don't want to be sending out super sensitive proprietary information to, people outside the company or something. Um, but even just emails, like if you're sending something to your boss, it is always always possible for people to forward those emails because maybe they need to loop somebody in to answer your question or to pass off your part of a project. So keep in mind as you're writing things, do you want this in writing? How are you writing this? Because even if this is something where you think, hey, I'm, bringing up an issue I'm having because I did my part of the project and this other group is not being responsive, so I'm kind of stuck at this point. You can communicate that to your boss to say, hey, here's the status of the project without being like, well, Stacy is, not responding to anything, right? You can say that in a more polite way to say, hey, I've reached out several times. I haven't gotten this information yet, so we're waiting on this part, right? Than saying that Stacy is being super rude and unresponsive. If you're going to be out of the office, making sure to utilize all those things so people kind of know when to expect when they can hear from you. A lot of companies have different communication platforms at work now. So, Teams is obviously something that Webster uses. Some places will have Slack. There's other ones out there. And so, whenever you're starting a new job, one of the first things that you want to kind of talk about in that orientation meeting is get a sense of how does your boss like to communicate with you? How do they like to handle questions? And what are ways that your colleagues also like interacting? So everywhere is going to be a little bit different. They might prefer that you have a weekly time with them. And so you can ask them questions, give them project updates in that one-on-one meeting. They might have more of an open office policy where you can just pop in if their door is open and they're working. They might, like an email. They may be fine with quick questions over Team or Slack or something similar. And so this is something that is often can be a source of conflict for people. Like if you're somebody where people stopping by your office disrupts your workflow and it's frustrating for you, then if the new person is always stopping by your office, you know, that's going to be a situation that can be a problem. So if you're kind of addressing that early on to say, okay, what do you all prefer? What seems to be the norm here? It's just more likely you're going to work better with people. And again, especially if you're kind of instant messaging folks, it can sometimes be tempting to be a little bit more chatty, more informal, the way you would be over texting. Different companies have different IT standards and different levels of intrusiveness. So there are absolutely companies where they will flag you if, certain words pop up, if you're linking to certain sites, if you're, going on Netflix, and that will send a flag to somebody. So those are things that can always happen. So again, you just want to be mindful of what you're doing and how you're communicating with people. It's always a good idea to make sure that you have some level of professional presence online. Again, you can kind of choose what makes sense in terms of your like privacy standards. It doesn't mean that you have to have all your information out there available to anyone. But that like if someone is searching you on LinkedIn, they could identify that, yes, are you the right person? If they see your photo, they can recognize you, if they can see, your current job title, things like that. So for different types of roles, you may have things like a portfolio or a website that would be helpful for you to maintain, especially if you're in more of like a creative profession, where you're showing your graphic design work or you're showing your acting reel. For some roles, like if you're in finance, you don't necessarily need to have anything probably beyond like a LinkedIn, just to help you stay connected with other folks. And again, just kind of be mindful of what boundaries you want to set, it's a lot easier to think through those things before they become a situation. So, maybe you have some accounts that are more personal, just for friends and family only, some that are, where you will connect with work colleagues. Like for me personally, I don't connect on social media other than LinkedIn with coworkers and things because I think it's just always potential for problems. Like, one place I worked, there was a little bit of drama one time because someone had called off sick at the last minute. And so somebody else had to, kind of scramble to pick up this other person's projects. And then that person had posted photos of themselves at the pool hanging out that day when they were supposed to be feeling really sick, right? And then that other person got upset that, okay, you passed all this work off to me at the last minute, and were you really all that sick? So things like that definitely do matter. People make judgments. If you're sharing things that align with your, values, your politics, again, sometimes that can be very emotionally charged topics. So just think through what you want to do. And, when you're at work, again, different companies might have kind of different senses of, what's considered to have good initiative. Because at one place they might say, yes, we want you to take on new projects. Like if you don't have enough to do, ask for things, find ways that you can contribute. And for other workplaces, they might say, it's great if you have ideas and you should present those to your boss, but don't just start working on other projects that aren't, necessarily aligned with the current goals of the department because especially as a new employee, there's often kind of a ramp up period. So you may not have like 40 full hours of work in your 40-hour work week at the very beginning as you're kind of getting acclimated, you're getting trained. Um, and then as they start giving you things and you do well and they give you more work, right? That kind of comes with a little bit of time. So, make sure to just follow through, communicate if you are having any kind of delays or issues. Like we mentioned earlier, sometimes that might not be to anything you've done, but just to let them know if there is that stall out. Um, and especially if people are training you, you're in that kind of new post grad job, make sure you're taking really good notes. That you're documenting processes because if people take the time to show you things and you say, great, okay, this makes sense at the time, and then, later you come back and ask them questions because actually you weren't paying all that much attention or you forgot what they clicked to get there, it's not really being respectful of their time. Versus if you say, hey, I got through these parts of the process that you showed me and I kind of got stuck here. Do you have advice for this part, right? People are going to be much more willing to help you in the future if they feel like their expertise is being valued and their time is being valued. And again, just kind of being positive, especially when you're a new professional to that office or in general. You don't want to get a reputation as being the person that's always complaining. Whether it is warranted or not, um, kind of always focus on listening, kind of getting the lay of the land first. Navigating office politics is a part of most jobs. And so sometimes it takes you a little bit of time to figure out who is really trustworthy, who has good information to share, who maybe doesn't always have the most current knowledge. Or, if there are changes or inefficiencies you're seeing, sometimes they might be that way for a reason, right? So as you've been there a while, it's totally fine to ask some questions to say, hey, can you tell me a little bit more about how this works? Or, kind of what made us decide on this type of process? Because if you just come in and start making changes and you say like, well, I think we could do this a lot better, and why don't we do this and why don't we do that? It might be that they've already done all those things, right? Or there's a very specific reason regulation wise why they do things the way they do. So you don't want to come in and do that and look out of touch. Again, most companies are going to have some type of handbook. They're not always going to go over those in depth with you. They might just kind of mention a few things and say this exists. So spend some time while you have time at the beginning to go through those, to understand those policies, to make sure that you're not going to violate any of those accidentally. What are kind of the norms for office supplies? If you've got like a kitchen, do you all have kind of free access? Do you have different kind of policies in place? Things like that. Just being aware of noise, like if you're listening to music, is that something that's going to be distracting for other people? If you have personal items in the office, what are other people doing? Because some places it's very much norms to have kind of decorations at your desk, and some places it might not be as appropriate if they don't really want people to have, as much personal things, especially if you're in a situation where, maybe you share desks because people work, hybrid. And so some days they're in the office and some days they're remote. So maybe you don't want to keep a bunch of things in the office if people are hot desking or something. And, as you're getting to know folks, if there's any kind of organizational chart that shows, this is different roles in the company and who they report to, that can be really helpful as you're understanding how different departments work together, how different teams work together. If you do have problems of some kind, to know that, okay, who is this person's boss? Like if we're consistently, hitting a bottleneck with this part of the process, maybe it's a good idea to, loop them in, or to say like, hey, could we have a sit down to talk about how we can work together more effectively? Because maybe there's something about how you're doing things or how their processes work that could be improved, or just might be better for you to be aware of what are the normal processing times like. A lot of companies will have things called employee resource groups. These are often based on identity groups. So they might be things like young professionals, or, Asian Americans, or, Hispanic, whatever that might be. Like LGBTQ plus. So sometimes those can be good ways to meet other people in the company who might have some things in common with you. And they often do kind of different types of programming. So, they might do things over the lunch hour. They might have kind of educational programs or have like a book club or things like that. So, look and see what opportunities exist, if there's any kind of formal mentoring programs. Because again, if you want to move up within a company, knowing people outside of your department is helpful, especially if opportunities come up, you have other people who can speak well of you. That's going to help you out in the long run. Again, follow whatever policies for your workplace. Another really common area of conflict sometimes comes along with asking out for work. In the United States, most employment is what we call at will employment. So outside of certain protected kind of statuses and anti-discrimination laws that exist, otherwise, you can be let go for any number of reasons. And so there's a lot of variability in how much vacation time different companies offer, how much sick time they offer. If they combine those, like some companies just have one bucket. And so if you're out sick caring for your child, if you're on vacation, it doesn't matter. You're just using that personal time. So, consider always kind of just giving people as much notice as possible. There might be whether spoken or unspoken norms about really busy times of year. So, like if you're in accounting, taking a 2 week vacation during tax season in March is probably not going to get you a lot of goodwill. So, try to kind of get a sense of those things so that you can take off the time you need to and you don't feel bad about that, but you're also not going to run afoul of any kind of standards or annoy everybody else in your department. And, if you are sick, again, some companies, they might let you take several days off, with just using your sick time. And then there might be a certain point where they say, well, you have to provide a doctor's note. And so, again, it doesn't mean that you can't take that sick time that you have, but you can't necessarily take a week or 2 weeks off and not communicate with people or say, yes, this is like a bigger issue than having a cold or something. So, make sure you're aware of those policies so you're not getting it into any problems. And just to know how they want you to ask off. They might have a system like ADP where you have to, request time so that it's coming off of your count for your personal days. Your boss might want you to email them, to call them, to let them know and say, yes, we can get this put into the system later, but as soon as you know that you're not feeling great or you're going to be out, that you let them know. And again, it's just kind of a good standard to make sure that if there is time sensitive things, that you are passing those off. And so you're saying, hey, this is where I saved the file for this presentation. I lost my voice. I'm not going to be able to present tomorrow, but here it is for somebody else, or whatever those might be. So overall, you really just want to make sure that you're building good habits for future, because the more that you start practicing these things as a student, as a professional, it just becomes second nature. You don't have to think about these things. Um, so often when we're talking with employers, we get a lot of comments from employers where they'll say, oh, well, sometimes, new graduates, maybe they don't always have the same work ethic, or we think that they don't really understand professional norms in the workplace. And what are you all doing to help students understand that? And so these are real things that can very much impact your long-term success, because when you have people who think about you, you want them to think that, yes, like you're consistent, you are reliable, you follow through on what you say you're going to do, you're a positive person, you're efficient. So, your reputation will follow you, even if you switch companies, you switch industries, especially if you're staying in kind of a similar geographic location. You never know where people end up, right? So you might have a colleague at one company and maybe you end up working at the same place down the road, right? So make sure that you're kind of keeping all of these things as that long-term planning. And, just figure out whatever systems work for you. However it is that you manage your email inbox, your project status, your workplace, your supervisor might have some certain preferences if they have, certain enterprise software that they use to track large scale projects that you're doing. But for other things, it may really just be within your own scope to get done your work in whatever appropriate time frame that exists. And, figure out what opportunities there are for professional development. Like I said, sometimes there are those employee resource groups at workplaces. They may have funding available, like if you want to pursue a graduate degree, if you want to go to a conference, pursue a certificate that's relevant for your field. So, some of those opportunities you may have to apply for. They might be limited, they might be competitive. They might be open to anyone who meets certain parameters, if you've been at the company for X amount of time, if it's related to your role. So it's always good just to kind of keep an ear out for those, to be aware and to know sort of how and when to escalate issues if they come up. Because again, this is just another area where you don't want to over escalate. Like if there's a minor problem, if you go two bosses above them, right, that's a big deal. And so that can be seen as kind of not being understanding of norms versus if you're like, nope, you know, was having an issue because this group wasn't getting their part of the project done. We talked, things were not happening. So then I looped in, their supervisor, or I talked to my supervisor first to say, hey, has this been a problem in the past? What do you advise? Sometimes it might be a setting where your boss might talk to their boss, right? So different people are going to have different takes on that. So it's a good idea to just understand all of those kind of norms for where you're at. So if you all have any questions, anything